Welcome to Fantasy Football Today Dynasty. I am your host, Heath Cummings, and it's another one-man mailbag. And this one's just a little bit different. 100% of the questions that I've got here today came from Blue Sky. I did just want to say, I put out a request for mailbag questions. I got way more than I could answer. So if I don't get to your question here, I will try to go back through the thread and answer those questions that I don't answer on the podcast. But if you want to get a question, dynasty question specifically answered, I seem to see a lot more of those questions over on Blue Sky. Go follow me over there. It's the same name as it is everywhere else. And we'll have a good time. Also, we are broadcasting on Twitter. I'll mention that again later. If you're on Twitter and you want to ask a question, we're going to answer chat questions a little bit later in the show. And I can only see those if you're on YouTube. So show up in the YouTube chat, ask me your questions, and I will get to as many of those as I can after we get through our Blue Sky questions. We've got questions today about Najee Harris, about Malik Neighbors, about Nico Collins, about Jawan Jennings. We're going to try to help contenders and rebuilders both. And I thought we'd start with some, quick waiver wire thoughts, because we do have some very, very low rostered players that have suddenly become fantasy relevant. And so I want to take a second to talk about those guys. The first one is Tommy DeVito. He is going to be the starting quarterback for the New York Giants. Daniel Jones has been benched. He will be cut in the offseason. We'll see if Daniel Jones makes a Sam Darnold or Geno Smith or Baker Mayfield-like return. But for now, it's Tommy DeVito's job for the New York Giants. And it's kind of interesting because if you look at last year, it was a much, much worse situation. Tommy DeVito was better as a passer than Daniel Jones. He threw for more yards per game than Daniel Jones, averaged more yards per attempt than Daniel Jones. Now, what DeVito did last year as a passer was worse than what Jones has done this year, but DeVito didn't have Malik Neighbors last year. So I am a little bit interested in a super flex league. He's obviously a must roster player if he wasn't rostered in your league. He might even be a top 24 quarterback this week because there's only 26 quarterbacks that are actually playing. But I do think there's a shot that with Neighbors and Wan'Dale Robinson, and it's still a little bit better offensive line than it was last year, I think, that we see Tommy DeVito produce like top 20 quarterback numbers. I'd be spending just a little bit of coin on him in a super flex league, specifically if I was contending and I was a little bit weak at that QB2 position. Tommy DeVito in a super flex league may just be the prize of the waiver wire. At running back, it's a little bit more complicated this week because we had a weird situation where Alexander Mattison and Zamir White both left their week 11 game with an injury. That meant Amir Abdullah was kind of the guy, but they just didn't run the ball very much. I don't know which of these guys is going to play, and I don't know which of these guys is rostered in your league. But what I will say is I think Alexander Mattison, Zamir White, Amir Abdullah, and Dylan Laube probably all need to be rostered in your dynasty league until we get more confirmation of who's going to play. It seems like Mattison dealing with a high ankle sprain is the least likely to play this week. And so if White is able to get active, then he'll at least have a chance to score a touchdown. Hasn't had a very good rushing average, doesn't have a very good matchup. If both White and Mattison are out, Amir Abdullah might be a top 30 running back and actually a good flex play. Abdullah is available pretty much everywhere. He's been very efficient as a rusher this year, largely because he's only used on passing downs. But I would think that you might want to flex Abdullah. And then Laube is just one of those guys. We may talk about him again later in the show with some stashes for 2025. He's just someone I want to make sure is on a roster. A lot of times we see these third-round rookie picks, and I'm talking dynasty drafts, not the NFL draft, but these third-round rookie picks that we get to this point in the season and people just don't have the room to roster them anymore. They've got too many injuries or they want to go pick up a Tommy DeVito, and so those guys get dropped. I want to make sure I'm rostering as many of those as I can, especially on those rebuilding teams. A little bit higher owned guy, but for shallow dynasty leagues, Elijah Moore, about 22% rostered, I think, in CBS leagues. Another good game, has consistently seen an average of about 10 targets per game with Jameis Winston. I think Jameis is going to keep throwing it 40 times per game for the remainder of the season. But go make sure Elijah Moore is rostered in your shallow dynasty league and maybe even consider starting him as a number 3 wide receiver this week, despite what is actually a pretty terrible matchup against the Pittsburgh Steelers. And then finally, we saw Jake Ferguson leave Monday Night Football with a concussion. We hope he's okay. Luke Schoonmaker was somebody I really, really liked coming out of college. He moved right into the Ferguson role last night, 18% target share for him. I would expect it's going to be Ceedee Lamb and then Schoonmaker as the number 2 target. And so I would view him, if Ferguson's out this week, as a top 12 tight end. He's a younger player too, so could be good for a rebuilder. Probably needs to be rostered in at least half of the deep dynasty leagues. So go see if he's available. Again, that's Tommy DeVito for Superflex leagues only. Elijah Moore in shallow leagues. Right now, make sure all the Raiders running backs are rostered. And then the second-year tight end for the Cowboys. We've talked about this a lot with Dallas. Like, it doesn't matter who the guy is. Jason Witten at 38 years old or something, a borderline top 12 tight end. Dalton Schultz, a borderline top 12 tight end. I think Blake Jarwin had half a season as a borderline top 12 tight end. Jake Ferguson walks right into that role. And so I don't think it's any different. It's just whoever the next guy is, that's what happens in this Cowboys offense. Let's get to our first question from a good friend of the show, actually multi-time guest of the show, and will be on next Tuesday's show. It's been a long time since we talked to John Bosch. We'll actually talk to him live next week, but we'll answer his question as the first question from Blue Sky this week. Who is the one player at each position currently not in the top tier at their position that could get there by the start of the 2025 season? And I thought this was interesting, first off, because I'm not sure we all agree on who the top tier at each position is. So I thought I'd kind of tell you that and then tell you who I thought could jump into that tier. So at quarterback, there's a really big top tier right now. I'd put Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, Jaden Daniels, Jalen Hurts, Patrick Mahomes, and Joe Burrow, all 6 is a 6-man top tier at the quarterback position. And if I was saying the most likely guy to jump into that tier by the start of the 2025 season, it's somebody that I, in error, already had there once in his career, Anthony Richardson. Just a disastrous turn of events earlier this year. He got benched for Joe Flacco. The team legitimately thought Flacco might help them win. That tells you how bad Richardson was. But you look at it after last week now, about half of his career games, he's been in the 29 fantasy point range or higher. Anthony Richardson, if he can just bring the lows up to where his bad games are 15 points, looks like a top 5 fantasy quarterback. He's got the age. He's got the rushing upside. If Anthony Richardson finishes this season on a heater in games that probably don't matter to the Colts, then you could absolutely see Richardson in that top tier, maybe not that far behind a Jaden Daniels or a Jalen Hurts as that rushing quarterback who can also throw it just a little bit. And so if I was betting on somebody to make that jump at quarterback, it would be Anthony Richardson. At the running back position, I've kind of got a 4-man top tier. Bijan Robinson, Jahmyr Gibbs, Breece Hall have been in that tier for a long time. Devon Achane showing the ability recently to be a workhorse back has jumped into the tier. I had a hard time finding current NFL running backs who I thought could jump into the top tier. So I'd say the guy who's most likely to do it by the 2025 season, who's not there right now, is Ashton Jeanty. That guy has been so good at Boise State. If some good offense makes him a first-round pick and hands him the ball 15 times a game in week 1, he's absolutely going to be in the top tier as a top 5 dynasty running back, maybe cheating a little bit by saying a rookie, but I think he's the right answer. At wide receiver, my top tier is Malik Neighbors, not number 1, but Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Malik Neighbors. I would hear an argument for Ceedee Lamb or Amon-Ra St. Brown or Nico Collins, but they're not quite there right now. I think the most likely guy to jump is actually Marvin Harrison Jr., who's been up and down. We thought he was the best rookie wide receiver in this class, and he's not performed that way so far. I thought, the way opposing defenses are double teaming him at a higher rate than basically any player in the NFL gives me great optimism that eventually he is going to be the guy that we thought he was going to be. Kyler's playing really good football right now. If you told me that Marvin Harrison Jr. has 3 or 4 good games to end the year, I think he's probably a top 5 dynasty wide receiver going into next year and probably in that elite tier. At tight end, the top tier is Brock Bowers. There's nobody close. The second tier is Trey McBride. There's nobody really close to him. I don't think anybody's jumping into either one of those tiers. I feel pretty confident we're heading into 2025. It's going to be Bowers, obviously over everyone. McBride, obviously number 2. And then we'll figure out 3 through 12 at the tight end position. We're going to answer a lot more of your questions, and I see the chat filling up with questions as well. That's awesome. We will get to those and more right after the break.
Historic rivals with unforgettable seasons meet in a game of honor. The Army-Navy game presented by USAA, December 14th on CBS.
We are back, and we've got a question from James doing a long rebuild, aiming for the 2027 draft. 12-team, PPR, Superflex, tight end premium. What a great league. Where my best tradable assets are all young. He's got Achane, he's got Anthony Richardson, he's got Worthy, he's got JSN, he's got Drake May, Jaden Reed. That's not a bad core for a group you're trying to compete in 2027. He's already collected some pieces down the road. He's in 10th place. Wants to know if he needs to sell anybody else. The one name that stood out to me is more about his position than the name, but it's Devon Achane. If I don't think I'm competing next year, I don't really want to roster any running backs. Now, Achane's a younger back, and so we might feel pretty secure, but we've had a lot of guys that we thought were surefire top 5 running backs at 22 or 23 years old. And 2 years later, they were not in our top 20 in the dynasty rankings. Running back changes just happen that fast. And so I'd be getting rid of my running backs, and Achane should bring you an enormous haul. It's like a contender able to add a young piece that also might be a league winner this year. They should pay a ton for that. I wouldn't sell him cheap at all, but I think you could really maybe get an elite wide receiver or a very good player at another position and a first-round pick. Like, shoot for the moon with Devon Achane. But if I was in that position, not competing in 2026, aiming for 2027, I'm pretty much always trying to get all of the running backs off my team. I know John Bosch, who's going to be on next week, he's kind of the first person who said that to me, and I agree. And so trade the running backs. I'm pretty good with holding everyone else. Maybe Jaden Reed, but he's not been good enough lately. I'm afraid his value is too low. Kevin wants to talk about running backs. Yes, what do you do with the older running backs like Christian McCaffrey, Derrick Henry as a contender after this season is over? And so I've got several of these teams, and a couple of them have Derrick Henry. One of them has Christian McCaffrey, and it is hard, especially if you don't win and you get to the end of the season, and now you've got 28, 29, 30-year-old running backs. He says, are you looking to sell regardless, or are you riding these guys into the sun? How do you handle aging running backs on your dynasty rosters? Well, first off, it's pretty much two paths for me. Contend or sell immediately. I just traded James Conner to Dan this morning, Conner and Kelsey, for a 2025 first. Yes, I tried to get Brian Thomas Jr. He stuck by what he said he would do, was a 2025 first. I lost again this week. I'm not going to make the playoffs. I got to get those two guys off my team. And so I'm probably, if I look at my roster and I think I might be able to contend next year, I'm just going to hope that Derrick Henry can keep defeating Father Time for at least one more season. I'm going to hope that Christian McCaffrey can give me the season I thought he was going to have this year, next year. I will hold as long as I think my team's still a contender. I think it's really hard to sell those guys in the offseason. I paid a second-round pick for Derrick Henry in the offseason and was a little nervous about that. It's been a great, great trade, but I wouldn't give more than those, and so I wouldn't expect anybody else to either. Next question comes in. How do you value high-value rentals in trades? For example, Juwan Jennings is putting up wide receiver 1 numbers, wide receiver 2 numbers, but probably we won't next season. I have several offers for him, but not seeing eye to eye on the compensation. So currently, Juwan Jennings is my wide receiver 54. And that tells you pretty much nothing about the answer to that question. This is a point that I really want to make. When you're looking at the trade chart, when you're looking at rankings, you need to be prepared to overpay in either direction. It really depends on where your team is. For Juwan Jennings as a contender, I might be willing to go trade a high second-round pick. I might be able to be willing to go trade an injured younger wide receiver because I want to win the title this year. At the same time, if I'm not really a contender and I've got Juwan Jennings on my team, I just need to get something for him because I'm not sure what he's going to be in the future. So I think players like that, their value is really hard to capture in a trade chart. It's really hard to capture in rankings. But if you're going for it, you should be willing to give more than you would accept if you're not. If that makes any sense. Again, wide receiver 54 for me right now. He's right in the same range as like a Devontae Adams. Probably in the same range as a Cooper Kupp. Guys who I think might have one more year. It's possible that Jennings is just the number one wide receiver from the 49ers from now on, but I don't actually believe that. I don't think you do either. A second round pick seems like a good trade for Juwan Jennings. We got Hassan asks the best players to stash now for the 2025 season. And this is a difficult question because how deep is your league? But I think if I can go get JJ McCarthy for a second round pick after watching him be drafted as a first round pick, I think Sam Darnold has shown us what this offense can be with even mediocre quarterback play. And Sam Darnold's also not done enough to where I think he's going to get a long-term deal. So I expect McCarthy to start next year, and I expect McCarthy to be very good. I would like to try to trade a second round pick to stash him for next year. At running back, I mentioned Dylan Lalby. I think Sean Tucker showed us just a glimpse, and now it's kind of fallen off, went on a bye, may have been dropped. I'd like to stash both of those guys. I think there's big time upside for Sean Tucker. Let's just get him to a situation where he can touch the ball a little more. Jermaine Burton, Javon Baker, two wide receivers who have done almost nothing as rookie wide receivers. If I could send a third for them, or if they're one of those guys that were a casualty on a contenders roster that needed to make a waiver wire pickup, I'd like to pick them up. I'd like to hold them until week 1 of next year. Still think there's immense upside for both Burton and Baker. And then Ben Sinnott, I think he should be very encouraged, despite the fact that he can't take the job from Zach Ertz. I thought he needed an Ertz injury, but Ertz's role in this offense is really exciting for me as someone who drafted Ben Sinnott. And so if the person who did draft him has gotten upset and dropped him or is willing to give him up for almost nothing, I'd like to have him on my team because I think next year he might be in that Ertz role. He might be seeing a 15 to 20% target share. Don't let what Brock Bowers did this year, what Sam Laporta did last year, make you forget that rookie tight ends are usually bad. And often there are tight ends that are good later in their career that were awful or irrelevant as rookies. So really any of those rookies, Jatavian Sanders probably done a little bit too much lately, so he probably doesn't count. But any of those rookie tight ends, I would be interested in adding. We got one more question here, I think, before we get to the rapid fire questions. Joe asks, how aggressive would you be trying to tier up into top tier receivers when you have plenty of depth? And he's got London, Pickens, Higgins, Flowers, Garrett Wilson, DK, Ridley, Addison, and he's always picking the wrong guys to start. But the others want egregious overpays to get into the top tier. And yes, Joe, they should. That's the way that this works. Whenever I put the trade chart out, I always like to remind people, if you're doing a 2-for-1 deal, you should be willing to pay at least 10% more. If you're doing a 3-for-1 deal, you should be willing to pay at least 20% more. Whoever's getting the best player in the deal should be willing to overpay. And so, I think you can make an argument that London and Pickens are too close to the top tier to be doing that with them. But Higgins, Flowers, even Garrett Wilson, with the way that Aaron Rodgers looks right now, definitely DK, Ridley, Addison. Like, I am paying up to get into the top tier with pretty much any of those guys. And I'm okay if I feel like I'm overpaying. That just should be, I think, part of the expectation. Always be willing to pay up to consolidate good players for great players. You can't pay too much. Let's go with some rapid fire questions. Again, all today's questions coming from Blue Sky. Appreciate those. We do have, I see 7. Nada's doing a great job of starring your chat questions that he thinks are good. So I will go through the chat questions after this rapid fire section. Is Noah Gray a legit buy for future looking teams? I do think it seems more likely than not that Kelsey's gone next year. I don't know for sure that Noah Gray gets a 25% target share if that happens. I think Noah Gray is a definite stash. I'd be okay if you wanted to trade a third for him. I wouldn't give anything more than that. We get a question about Malik Neighbors, two of them actually. Momo asked, how do you rank Neighbors now given future QB uncertainty? And we had another question, Nico or Neighbors? And I think that's a great one. Right now, I have Neighbors as wide receiver 3 in my dynasty rankings. I talked about him as a tier 1 guy. Nico, kind of a tier 1B guy. He's my wide receiver 6. They are close enough that I think this could change by the end of the year. But my real thought is that we've probably seen the quarterback play in New York be as bad as it's going to be in Malik Neighbors' NFL career. And he's still a top 12 wide receiver for the season. The fact that they have gone to Tommy DeVito and seem to maybe be committing to the tank for the first time, they should have done it 3 years ago. Like, he might actually have a good quarterback, Malik Neighbors, as soon as next year. I'm not sure his future quarterback situation is any more concerning than, say, a Justin Jefferson's, or well, that's probably it. But Jefferson's in that top tier also. So I'm viewing Malik Neighbors as a top 3 dynasty wide receiver. He is number 3. I've got Nico Collins at number 6. They're both awesome. I wouldn't make a strong bet on which one I'll like more in 6 months. We got a contender traded Trevor Lawrence and a first for Caleb Williams and a mid-second. 12-team Superflex League. How'd I do? I like it. I'd give it an A-. I think there's a little bit of risk that Trevor Lawrence comes back after his bye and is better than Caleb Williams the rest of this season, and so you hurt yourself as a contender. But I do strongly prefer Caleb in Dynasty over Lawrence. I was encouraged. Caleb Williams, 7.5 yards per attempt in the first game after they fired the offensive coordinator. That was his 3rd most efficient week as a passer. He also ran more than he has. And so I do think we'll see a strong finish from Caleb Williams. I definitely rather have Caleb Williams in 2025 than Lawrence. A-, that's a good trade. IDP Center asks, what's Najee Harris's value if the Steelers don't re-sign him? I have him at RB 32 right now. That's pricing in a little bit of risk. So I think if he told me the Steelers had given him a contract, he'd probably be at RB 25, which is kind of where he has lived, like a low-end RB2. If he's not re-signed, then his value is really going to be determined by where he lands. I could see a better situation where we like Najee more, but there's more risk. So that's why he's RB 32 right now in my rankings, pricing in that possibility that he's in a worse situation. But I think more likely than not, he's not. Frank says 10 team. What do you do with Ceedee Lamb? Start him every week. My friend Joey Wright had a great post on Blue Sky this morning talking about the Ceedee Lamb history with Cooper Rush. He was 16 PPR fantasy points per game in 2022. The first game with him this year, he had a terrible game because the sun was in his eyes and he didn't catch a touchdown. He catches that touchdown. He scores 15 fantasy points in that game. Scored 18 fantasy points last night. Ceedee Lamb is a must-start number 1 wide receiver and a top 4 dynasty wide receiver. Whew. That'll do it for the rapid fire from Blue Sky. And I've got 11 of your questions marked here. I might even go a little bit longer. So if you still have a question here in the chat, now would be a great time to ask it. If you're watching on Twitter and you have a question, come over to YouTube, join the chat, maybe like, maybe subscribe. That'd be fantastic. I would really appreciate it. And then ask a question, and I'll try to get to it before the end of the show. Vinny says, Vinny and the Jets, Gus Edwards or Roschon Johnson for next week and beyond. So for dynasty purposes, strongly prefer Roschon Johnson. And next week, have Roschon Johnson ranked higher. The interesting thing, and I wouldn't have thought this coming into the year, Roschon Johnson's a goal line back. Guess what? Edwards is not. Dobbins has scored 8 touchdowns. Edwards has 0. Roschon just as likely, if not more likely, to get a carry inside the 5 as DeAndre Swift. So I would prefer to start Roschon this year, and because of the age difference, I'd rather have Roschon long term. Tristan says, should I trade Amon-Ra and Jonathan Taylor for Mike Evans and James Conner? This is not a dynasty question, Tristan. That's okay. Tied for second in redraft. I would rather have Amon-Ra and JT in redraft, and certainly in Dynasty. Edwards says he's offered Terry McLaurin for Jordan Addison and Cortland Sutton. Should I accept? He has Puka, St. Brown, and Jawan Jennings. So, yeah, I think that's a good deal. I don't have probably too much difference between McLaurin and Addison in Dynasty. But I would definitely, I'm assuming if you're making this deal, you're contending. If you're contending, I think I would do it. If you're not, I would rather have Addison. EffortlessShots, buckets, like that little avatar as well. What should I do with a team that's one game back of the playoffs with aging vets and none of my own rookie picks? I've got a confession, because I talk on the show all the time about you don't want to be in the middle. I had too many teams this year that ended up in the middle, and I've got a couple that are in this spot, and one of them is that team that I just traded Connor and Kelsey for a first. I think you have to be really honest. Look at your schedule. Look at your bye weeks. How many week 12 and week 14 buys do you have? How many of the teams you're playing in week 12 and week 14, do they have a bunch of guys on bye? Do you actually have a chance to get into the playoffs? And if it looks, I would have to feel like I was like a 2-1 favorite to snatch that spot. I need to have very few week 12 buys, very few week 14 buys, and be playing some weak teams. And if that's the case, then I'll go for it. And just, if it doesn't work, we're probably in a 2-year rebuild. If I look at the schedule honestly and objectively, and I really don't have a very good chance at all, I'm trying to consolidate Kelsey and Connor for a first. Just any running back 28 or older, I'm trying to get rid of them. Wide receivers 30 or older, I'm trying to get rid of them. I might not get my own first round picks, but I'd like to get some other people's and maybe don't make it a 1-year rebuild instead of a 2. SaltyHooligan says, still thinking about selling Lamb, sell or hold? I'm holding. As I said, I think he's a must start. I think he's a top 12 wide receiver this year. I think he's a top 4 wide receiver in Dynasty. Maybe if you're a contender and you want to sell for a couple of starters, but again, I think Lamb's going to be very good the rest of the year. So I'm not trading him to get a top 15 wide receiver that he might just be better than this year and then a lot better than for Dynasty purposes. So mostly holding. No one in my league wants Tyreek Hill, so I'm stuck. What's his Dynasty value for 2025? This happens with older players, sometimes through no fault of their own. Listen, Tua missed some time. Tyreek was bad in those games. He's come back. The offense hasn't been quite right. He finally had one good game. I think now's the time to try to sell him. But I wouldn't give him away. Currently, my wide receiver 18 in Dynasty. I'd be thrilled if I could get any kind of first-round pick for him. I don't think I would take 2 seconds unless I was in one of those situations where like my team's just a catastrophe, because there is a risk that this is his value could continue to just go down. Ben asks, do you suggest a trade deadline for Dynasty? John Bosch and I were going to talk about that next week in depth. So make sure you tune in next Tuesday, 11:30, right here. But I don't know. Like, I have leagues that have both. I think the league should come to a decision themselves. I probably, like, if I had to make the executive decision myself, I would say no trade deadline. There are some negatives to it, and I think some people who say no trade deadline just kind of ignore those. But overall, I would say no trade deadline. I slightly prefer over a very, very late trade deadline. And last question, traded Mostert, Mooney in a 2026 first for a 2025 second and Breece Hall A++. Great job. Great way to finish the show. Thank you to everybody who sent in your Blue Sky questions. Thank you to everybody who was active here in the chat. Thank you to everybody who watched on Twitter. Thank you to Nada for helping me get this all put together. We will talk to you guys next Tuesday.